Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar on setting development goals. My name is Kiara Frechette. I'm the Nonprofit Programs Director here at Spur Local. I'm going to give people about 1 more minute to log in, and then we will get started. If you have any questions throughout today's webinar, you're welcome to ask them at any point. And the way you'll do that is just submit a question via the question box that just looks like an icon of a chat with a question mark inside of it. We will be recording today's webinar as well as sending out the slides, and those will go out in the evaluation email following this webinar. Again, welcome to anyone who just joined. Thanks for being here. If you have questions, feel free to submit them in the question box. It just looks like a chat icon with a question mark inside of it. Today we're going to be talking about setting development goals. So what I'm going to be walking through are a couple different trends that we're seeing this year as it aids in the setting of the goals, and then kind of walking through the process for choosing and selecting goals at your organization. I'd say this is kind of a 102 webinar. It's still pretty high level. We're going to be talking about the process for setting the goals, and we'll be encouraging you throughout to kind of use your own data for your organization to kind of benchmark and set additional metrics. So we'll be going into it high level about the development goal process, whether you have done this in the past and are looking to kind of make it more robust, or you've never set specific goals or trying to think of some new ones to set and monitor and track. This will be a good webinar to attend. All right, so jumping right into things here, just want to start off with some general guidance, as I mentioned, starting to talk about what are we seeing this year? So as you are, we're in February, so you probably already have some of these goals set. But as you're thinking about the rest of the year, maybe your fiscal year starts in July, so you have some time to set these goals, revisit the year, plan for the second half of the year. Here's kind of what we're seeing. We just see generally that our audiences, both nonprofits themselves and our audiences, have many distractions, right? With the political climate and different current events, environmental events. There's a lot of social issues in focus in mainstream conversation. We're also seeing a lot of nonprofit sector changes, and we're not really sure what's exactly going to happen as a result of conversations at that national level. So really just thinking, especially as you think about your development planning, making sure that looking and kind of reviewing your narrative is a part of your plan this year. Really important to think of how you're communicating your message, how you're communicating action, how you're communicating stability. It's going to be really important this year because we have such a distracted audience. So how are we standing out in this space? On the major donor side of things, kind of just want to touch on two larger groups before I get into another kind of more broad generality here. So major and grassroots donors. Major donors over the last 18 months have continued giving, but flat or growing just slightly. So there's some positivity with that. But with our major donors, to ensure that our own organizational major donor giving stays flat or grows, we really need to invest in stewardship and relationships. This is something I know we're all doing, but especially for those longtime donors who maybe we feel are really ones that we can count on, ones that are giving year to year, really taking some time maybe to steward them a little differently this year and to make sure we're being intentional. These major donors, because of all of the distractions and kind of current events, may be distracted with their giving or choose to give elsewhere this year due to kind of the necessity or the urgency that they're feeling. So making sure that we are staying top of mind for them. I know we already do this, but just kind of making sure that we're really thinking about them this year. On the grassroots side of things, so our lower level donors, there's a national decline, and it's likely to have continued through 2024. This is something we're probably still going to be seeing, though certainly as data comes out, we will share it. This decline, though, the positive side here is it does appear to be slowing. As we think about this, those that we have lost are also an opportunity. So as we think about setting development goals or prioritizing grassroots donors, encouraging folks to set a goal now for the number of new donors and making a plan to acquire these folks. This could also look like looking at your LIBUNs and SciBUNs who are grassroots or donors or gave once in the past to try to bring them back into the fold and urgency of your organization. And then overall, like I mentioned with major donors, but this really underlies a lot, just like narrative and focusing on that underlies a lot of what we're doing this year. On the side of stewardship, there's an increased demand for relational cultivation and stewardship and that personal connection, even at those lower gift levels. So as we think about it, what we encourage folks to do is think about how you can personalize, your mass communications, so that because we have limited capacity. So, if you're not simple things like using mail merge to make sure people's names are included in the emails, or segmenting your lists. Are these people who have volunteered in the past? Are these people who have attended an event? They give in the last year? Thinking of some ways to customize our messaging so that those that we do have are continuing to give to our organization. The kind of most cost-effective way to raise money is to keep those that we already have. So we're really thinking about stewardship as a major part of our goals this year. So as you're setting goals, kind of outside understanding the general landscape here, as you're setting goals generally, there are we see kind of two plans that guide our organizations, and that's usually that development strategy and our strategic plan or strategic goals that the organization has. Our development strategy is so core, and kind of spending some time here today talking about building out our goals for the year is really important, because the funds that we raise are the ones that allow our organization to stay open and continue delivering critical impact in the region. Development strategy funds our strategic plan, and our strategic plan is the roadmap for why funding matters. Development strategy is resource allocation for strategic activities, and strategic plan defines resources needed for the program. As we think about this, both all staff should be familiar with the development strategy and strategic plan for the organization. Now, the development strategy will be owned by the person who is owning development at your organization, but staff should be aware because they really do go hand in hand. So as you're thinking about this, we always encourage folks to, if you have those, annual goals, strategic plan, whatever that kind of major goal guiding document for your organization, whatever exists, to definitely look at that and see how will that impact development, and how will development impact that as you're setting your goals, because they really do go together here. So as we think about this, again, process, I'm going to walk through parts of the process here as we are determining what goals to be setting. As we think about setting these goals, the first thing, right, is getting the process right for choosing these goals. It's very easy, right, for one person to set the goal, kind of just moving forward with it because it's right or based on your experience, but making sure that others involved, getting that buy-in allows for higher effectiveness of getting to these places and getting, team support. Development, while usually falling on one person of the organization, is not a one-person job. You're going to need to get data, right, from the programs team or volunteers. You're going to be having conversations with other, major donors, maybe transferring relationships from executive director. So there's a lot of people involved, even though one person is owning it. So it's important that we get our process laid out right at the onset. So as you think about this, the owner, this is your development staff member who is setting these goals. Generally, a development director could be, a development manager, depending on the organization. The goals should really begin with a staff member who will be responsible for carrying them out. As you're starting to plan for these goals, you're looking right at that strategic plan or some, sort of annual goals. And the next thing you're doing and really thinking about is starting with your last year of data and those current trends, right? I already shared some of those. Right now is ripe for the time that so many organizations are putting out their annual reports, or so many kind of reporting groups and fundraising groups are putting out kind of what the landscape this year looks like or last year looked like. So take those trends, but really look at your last year of data and kind of compare yourself to yourself. Typically, we see that growth is about 5 to 10% in most areas without kind of considering context of where you've prioritized as an organization. So as you're thinking about this, again, if you grew 50% in one area because of maybe in individual donors, because you really prioritized them last year, you may not grow 50% again. You may do that more 5 to 10. But if you're really prioritizing and kind of deprioritizing others, you could expect higher growth. So just thinking about your last years of data and the trends, and then setting metrics for yourself. Once that person who is owning the plan has proposed and kind of drafted the plan, goals should then be discussed with any other involved team members. So, right, this could be your executive director, and then sharing with development or opposite direction, again, depending on seniority. So if you have maybe in development development associate and executive director, maybe the executive director is the one who's creating the goals, and then the associate is the one who is reviewing them second. But if you have that development director, likely they're the one setting out the plan, bringing it to executive director. So it just depends on seniority how that works there. You want to get the whole group on the same page before sending off and be clear about whose role is what. Who is prospecting grants, who is writing the grants. Are you using any contractors or consultants or services? Who's having meetings, who's setting up meetings? Just thinking about those kind of key decision points that can sometimes muddle the communication side of things and understand who's involved. Especially when it comes to grant reports, this is a great time if you are going after certain grants that may require additional reporting that you're not currently doing on the program side, making sure that your program's team members looped in. They're probably not going to be that decision maker, right, in terms of a role, but they will be kept aware of what's happening. And then finally, as you're setting out your development goals for the year, the board should take the role of asking questions, but not guiding the goals. So kind of working with the executive director to combine the goals with the budget, especially if increasing, you need to talk about the resources needed to do so. So if you're increasing capacity, if you're increasing your funds, what would that look like on part of the staff to do so? So usually this development strategy is brought to the board the board fundraising committee, really just so that they can see this. And eventually they'll be looking at this as it relates to the budget in the coming year. And this is assuming that your board is more of a governance board. If your board is a working board and you are functioning as staff, you're probably going to have that role of owner of this plan. So again, this is just more so if your board is involved in that governance side of things. Depending on the roles you've given board members, they may just be looking at this and okaying it. And kind of at the highest level, they are asking questions strategically, not necessarily guiding those goals. As you're thinking about what's realistic, especially as a small team, a couple different things to keep in mind, things that we're all aware of, but always like to highlight here, especially if we are looking or thinking about pursuing new opportunities and need to make a case either to executive director or to our board why we might need more resources and how we can be successful in this. So a couple things to think through for each of the goals that we're setting. One is what time do we have? Growth means more responsibility. We're going to have to do more stewardship. We might have to do more foundation reporting. We're going to, maybe do more cultivation activities. So just understanding what does, taking on 3 or 4 new grants mean? What does prioritizing major donors look like, and kind of building out the time? Not to say that we shouldn't do it, but more so understanding the reality of what that looks like. Resources, do we need to update our CRM system? Is it working against us? Are there any upfront costs of software that we want to use? Are we buying a prospecting software like Grant or the GrantStation? Do we have the connections we need? Sometimes we find that boards will say, or board members will say, oh, we should, get funding from Walmart, right? Do we have a connection to Walmart? How will we get connection to Walmart? That's not a great example, but just thinking about those types of things, like, do we have those connections? What time will it take to build those connections? Who in our network has them? Just understanding what resources we need to do tasks. People, right skills, and right amount to accomplish plans. For the most part, you likely have the right people on your team, but maybe that when we're thinking about time and resources, we realize we might need another person, or we're going to bring in someone who's a grant writer, because that's a nice specific amount of time that we can have someone come into the organization, support us. And it's not that we're not a good grant writer, but somebody else is something we can outsource. So just think about that side of things. And then finally, just knowledge, asking yourself if your team has the right experience and background to achieve the goal, or if any training is needed. Is there professional development that you need to be able to pursue this? Are there, free or low cost opportunities for you to do this? Looking into that. When we're thinking about making sure they're realistic, want to make sure that these goals, again, aren't just set from the board themselves. We're the ones who know how the work can get done. Certainly always open to hearing how the board is thinking about it, especially if they want to be involved in introducing us to folks or helping us to, review language we're using. However, just kind of, again, thinking about realistic, we don't want to commit to something that we haven't already assessed for time, resources, people, and knowledge. As clear as we can make these, I know a lot of people talk about SMART goals. However you determine a realistic goal is, you want to make sure that your goals are clear. You want this to be specific and trackable, if we're trying to increase something, that we're tracking what we're doing to do that, and then assessing afterwards, did we hit that metric? Did we accomplish what we set out to do? And the best way we can do this is through clarity of the goal itself. So kind of all this boils down to, as we think about what we're choosing to pursue in the development space, kind of two questions, one around alignment and one around feasibility. So asking yourself, as I'm setting a goal here for, our development strategy for the year, is this aligned and is it reasonable? On the alignment side, is this, yes, this relates to our strategic plan or the work of another department. If you don't have a strategic plan, you can substitute that for a strategic goal, annual goal, whatever that might be. The other answer, right, is no, it's independent of our organization's efforts. Sometimes this is what a board member might suggest, though of course board members can be a wealth of knowledge in other things, but that maybe this is just, an example here. As we think about feasibility, is it reasonable? Yes, you have, or you can get everything you need. Or no, I would need to greatly expand my capacity. And answering no on both of these, it doesn't mean that we can't pursue, but we need to put some additional planning into this to make sure that it can take place if prioritized, that we're going to be able to achieve this. So as we are setting goals, just ideally, right, we're having a yes, you have what you need. Yes, it relates to strategic plan. A lot of times we find into, yes, it's aligned with what we're doing, but no, I need to expand my capacity. And if you're finding that many of your goals kind of fall into that, yes, it's aligned, no, you need capacity, that's room to kind of know what capacity is necessary as you bring it to others, as you look for funding or support elsewhere. Under alignment, I would also say the other question we can be asking ourselves is why. We aren't just setting goals to set goals, or we shouldn't be. But if our organization has a goal of increasing individual donors, why is that? Do you want to diversify? Is it because you haven't had many in the past? The why will determine how you go about setting the goals for actions you're going to take. Working to pursue, for example, individual donors because we're working to diversify funding might mean that there are trade-offs in terms of our time working on stewarding other donor groups. But if we're looking for additional because we don't have any, your campaign might be more targeted towards partnerships or might be targeted towards building awareness first. So again, just thinking through, yes, aligned and is it reasonable, but taking it back to that larger plan, why are we trying to pursue this? What do we think this will mean for our organization? Because what it will mean, the why behind it will change the actions we take because of it. So I want to now just dive into a couple different specific opportunities as we look with donors and as we think about types of goals we can set in these areas. Again, I'm suggesting these as ways to kind of start the brainstorming, but you'll want to look at that why, just because, I'll be sharing some opportunities with types of donors. Doesn't mean that we're suggesting that you set all of these goals. But again, thinking about what would be important, what would be the impact, then how will I actually do this? So specifically here with opportunities for donors, this is getting more supporters and or support. And the three main types of goals that we see in this space are around volume, amount, and type. So volume is, setting the goal around the number of donors you have. So this could be a retention or acquisition style goal. So that's kind of an example of what I meant by the why. Say we want to increase the number of donors that we have by 50%. So is that going to be, if we decide that that's going to be, setting the goal around the number of donors total we have. So if we decide we have a certain amount, is it that then we need to acquire them, or is that we need to retain a certain amount and acquire others? Is that we just need to retain all of our donors? So as we're looking at that, that's going to be three different tactics. If we're just focusing on donor retention, that's going to, look like a lot of stewardship and cultivation. If it's acquisition, we're going to be doing a lot of awareness. We're going to run maybe community campaigns, those partnerships. If we're doing a little bit of both, we're going to split our time between both. So just understanding the why behind it. National retention rate generally is 50%, but encourage you to use your own data of what that looks like year over year. 80% is a really great goal to be setting for yourself, again, above national data, which usually local and small organizations perform better in. And just acknowledging that acquisition is hard right now, so you want to be realistic. You can also be setting a goal around volume of donors that you're trying to acquire. So these are some options for volume. On the amount, this is pretty obvious. A lot of what we're usually setting and talking about is in this amount side, either absolute dollar amount or relative amount, percent more in total than last year. Could also be a breakdown to goals around, what is our biggest gift, average first time gift, raising that up, and what does that look like? How many people do we have at that level, and seeing some of those metrics. Especially, average gift just generally is a good barometer for your development program. How are we keeping people, both, those grassroots donors and major donors, engaged in our organization? And then finally, you can set goals, especially around opportunity, around type. So this is the relative percentage of funding from various main sources. That could be individual grants, corporate, earned, and really just thinking about that mix of donors. As you think about this, one way to also be thinking not only is that individual grants, corporate earned, but, long-time donors versus new, grassroots versus major donors, end of year versus recurring. So setting that number or monetary goals for any of these may be strategic in nature, especially if you are going for, major donors. Those are going to take a lot more time to cultivate. We're probably going to spend some money or time prospecting those folks, building connections with them, getting them invested in the organization. So that's going to take some serious staff time. So just understand that that's a strategic goal. Or, as we're thinking about type, we're really thinking about diversifying our funding so that no one source of our funding is more than 70% of our revenue each year. So that is a strategic goal that we're going to maybe deprioritize some groups and prioritize other groups. So again, having these conversations with who needs to be involved in these decisions, but this is just another way to be thinking about a goal is around the type here. Outside of the specific donors, the other one I wanted to just touch on here is opportunities with foundations. Very similar, still talking about number, amount, and type, so I won't spend too much time here, but really thinking about, in the number side of things, how many foundations fund you, but also how many LOIs you submit. Funding percent is a good to consider here as well, and to be realistic about your success rate, especially if unsolicited, because of your time. So this is something, when we're talking about what's realistic in terms of time, resources, people, knowledge. Foundations are an easy place that we can say we can go after more, but going after more, especially if unsolicited, doesn't always, lend itself to us hearing back and receiving that funding. So just thinking, especially if the board is pushing you or others are pushing you in this, just doing some research, understanding what's realistic, and making sure that that's kind of in mind as you're setting these goals. Amount, this is an obvious goal around total, but it could also be around percent upgrading, average grant size, average new grant size. The goal each year should be to approach 100% retention, that you're keeping all the grants you have, unless it was something that was sunsetting, of course, or something that you knew was coming to an end. With some of these, not only 100% retention, but some growing. Each year you're getting maybe one new grant, or some of the, at least 50% are increasing by a set amount. That'll vary by foundation and by opportunity, but something you can certainly be looking at. And then finally, type, retentions versus growth, local, regional, or larger, corporate or community or family. Could also just be a goal around prospect research if foundation funding isn't something that you've explored as much in the past, or isn't something you've prioritized. So thinking about what does that prospect research look like. So again, these are just some options for goals, but would really encourage you as you're setting this, just understanding, how do development goals play with strategic goals? How do they support them? And then having those larger questions of, is it aligned? Is it feasible? And then using these slides as you're setting your goals to kind of determine what specifically are you going to think about as it relates to accomplishing those goals. I won't spend too much time here. This is mainly meant to be kind of a take-home slide, if you will. This is from our 2024 new class. If it's helpful for folks, I like to just share this so you can see kind of where the funding comes from. We have our new class members every year share kind of a pie chart of what their funding looks like in terms of individual giving, grants, corporate giving, earned revenue, and other. And so this is what it looks like. Majority of our partners in that new class, right, they're getting, 40% of their funding is coming from grants, followed by individual giving, earned revenue, and then other, and then corporate. And other tends to involve events. So this isn't meant to say that you need to follow this, and if your funding mix looks different, that you should change it to be this. This is just meant to be a benchmark, especially if you're an organization that's a little newer. Maybe you don't have your own funding, a lot of funding data to look back on, just to see where similar size organizations in this region are. This is a slide that could be helpful. And then finally, as we're setting all of our goals, I'd be remiss if I didn't touch on evaluation. So just making sure we're staying on top of progress. So recommend just checking in quarterly, every 6 months and annually as part of a plan. Quarterly, just doing a quick dashboard with overall amount, amount for top 3 channels or kind of ways we're getting, and then 2 to 3 specific goals. We always encourage a spotlight system. Red is hasn't started or is behind, yellow in progress, or and green, achieved or on track. And this is a great way to share with the board. If we decided we are going to increase the number of foundations, how many have we prospected? Have we not prospected any? If we have a certain number in mind, if we haven't done any, that's going to be red. Maybe we've reached out to 3 new groups, it's yellow. Or 3 means we're on track, right? It could be green. So just using a stoplight analogy quarterly, sharing that with your board so they can stay on top of where you are development-wise for the organization. It could also be something you're sharing with an executive director if you are a development staff member on this webinar. Every 6 months, doing a little bit more slightly in depth, so kind of checking in halfway through the year, and then again, we'll check in at the end of the year, looking at that scorecard, looking at any, especially if we set retention rates and growth, just deciding if we're on track. Do we need to update? Have we deprioritized any of our strategic goals? That's going to change, the way that we are looking for funding to support that work. This can be hard due to the episodic nature of nonprofit funding. Majority of funding comes in at the end of the year, unfortunately, for all of us. But just knowing that, keeping track, especially if you can do year to year, where you were last year compared to where you are this year, doing that kind of look at, every 6 months. And then annually doing a full evaluation. So this is looking if you hit your goals, but more importantly, the why yes or why not. This gets back to the, how are we doing our goals? Again, if we want to have a certain number of individual donors or percent of our funding coming from individual donors, and we decided to prioritize acquisition over retention because that is what we needed to do to hit that number. If we don't hit it, why is that? Did we actually end up getting different type of donors? Maybe we have more major donors than we thought we were going to have. Maybe we did decide that our donors were at risk of leaving, so we spent a lot of time on retention. So we didn't hit that number because that number was more on acquisition, but we spent more time on retention this year. So just again, looking at the how and why behind why we may not hit goals. As you have this, debriefing the team and board as needed, as necessary, as people are looped in, sharing with folks, and then just using this analysis each year to guide your future goals. Does it make sense to pursue that goal again this year or in the next year, or do we need to adapt and change it differently? So last slide I'll leave you with here, and if you have questions, feel free. I don't see any yet, but feel free to put them here in the question box. Again, just a chat icon with a question mark inside of it. But as you're thinking about some tips for the year ahead, first, just creating some first metrics. Whoever is owning this, kind of setting out what that looks like, making sure you're reviewing strategic planner goals to start setting what that looks like. Get your board involved early and late. And what we mean by this is starting them off by understanding the process, asking those kind of strategic questions, and then making sure that they're kept aware later in the process during while you are evaluating success and where you might need them, right? You might it might be helpful for them to brainstorm around connections or new opportunities or help to prospect. Realistic, considering resources when deciding goals. And then in terms of different types of donors here, focusing on those individuals, right? Setting an overall amount and 1 to 2 other metrics in the individual space, and then setting overall amount and 1 to 2 other metrics in the foundation space. Again, what those will be depends on kind of what your goals are as an organization, but recommend starting out there. And then making sure you're starting that 3-tier evaluation process with quarterly and making it as efficient as possible. As much as we can as a small team. I know this sometimes feels like a lot, but if we're setting 3 goals in different areas, we're evaluating quarterly and trying to be as personalized as possible while also batching communications, definitely can be successful here. All right, I'm not seeing any questions come through. If anyone wants to talk offline, you have a specific situation or a goal you're setting, happy to connect and share more in depth. Or if you're thinking about the how you're going to accomplish a certain goal, always happy to be a resource. I know we didn't fully get into that today in this kind of 102 webinar where we're going over just the process and what to be keeping in mind, but really would be open to talking with folks about that if helpful. All right, thanks for being here. We will be sending all this in the follow-up evaluation email, and we'll see you next time.